River, maybe you want to just start.
Yes. So here's the book again, just to show you the cover. And I'm going to read from the very, very beginning, the first paragraphs, as a way of introducing some of the themes and some of the questions that the book addresses. And these paragraphs take us all the way back to 1981. In August 1981, Sally McKean and I went to the USSR. We were 18 and not long out of boarding school. Fueled by reading Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Solzhenitsyn, fascinated by socialism and hungry for adventure, we boarded an Aeroflot plane for Moscow. Soon we discovered we had unwittingly booked our tour behind the Iron Curtain with a travel agent affiliated to the Communist Party of Great Britain, and that our travelling companions were trade union activists and party members. Undismayed by our naivety and privilege, they took us under their wing. In train carriages lumbering between Russian cities, we learned there was no war but the class war, and how to sing the Internationale. Plied with vodka and greeted with heartfelt speeches by young communists and workers, we were spellbound by the apparent commitment to peace, the statistics on full employment, education, and gender equality. We queued to see Lenin's embalmed body in Red Square, tried to slip away from our long-suffering minder, Victor, nibbled hot pirozhki at street stalls, and browsed the tourist shops that Russians were barred from entering. Some of this book's seeds were planted that summer in utopian visions of justice and solidarity. As we sang, drank, argued, and drank some more with our newfound communist aunties and uncles, we absorbed their commitment, entranced by how they welcomed our questions. But undercurrents lingered in those Soviet hotel rooms, sorrows drowned in alcohol, guilt's undertow, party lines that brooked no dissent, the hazards of idealism, the pressure to sacrifice oneself on the altar of a just cause, the despair at a ceaseless tide of injustice.
Thank you, River. So I was certainly hearing this kind of tension, isn't it? A sort of formative tension in your life as a writer and a would-be activist between these sort of very strong idealist tendencies and obviously the shadow side of idealism. And I suppose I wondered about this idea that so much in our Buddhist training of the ideal of altruistic activity as the sort of pinnacle of wisdom, I suppose, and often the sort of idea of becoming a bodhisattva or aspiring to a bodhisattva life. It can bring a lot of idealism with it.
Yes, it sure can. And, you know, the next paragraphs after those introductory paragraphs go on to talk about, you know, how I then, became sort of involved in more activism and social engagement, social justice, and then rode these waves of burnout and despair, and then more kind of idealism and more burnout. And then, you know, finally sort of becoming interested in the Dharma and wondering how that would fit. And then slowly seeing how the tools that the Dharma offered could really support, you know, this is the kind of the core of the book. How do we support ourselves in these times of great great global, great individual, great collective challenge without burning out, without drowning in despair. And yes, the Bodhisattva ideal is a wonderful aspiration and a wonderful image from the Buddhist tradition. And, it's there in early Buddhism, and it's there, of course, later. And with all these images and aspirations, with all their kind of beauty and all their wholeheartedness, there's also something, the way that can also then mesh with the idealism or the sense of ourselves as somehow beyond, the kind of sometimes often messy, complicated challenges of our lives. And how do we bring that, those beautiful images and those wonderful aspirations and important aspirations together with what is it like moment to moment to encounter, to meet what is here and now without kind of, bypassing it. This tendency we can have, this word that's often used, spiritual bypass, to kind of, try and get round or underneath or above the kind of, the actual kind of grit of our lives, which is often in that place of meeting what is, really difficult in our lives and in our world.
I mean, it's at the heart. That question is at the heart of your book, isn't it? Like the book itself unfolds a kind of holds. It's not one answer, is there? I think that's one of the things I found really lovely. It's both in terms of Buddhism and the Brahma Viharas, but also in the way you approach the book. There's not one answer to idealism, burnout, sustaining compassion. There are many, and it's sort of what is appropriate at the right time to discern what of these dimensions of the sustaining of compassion are needed right now in the moment that we find ourselves in, at any moment that we find ourselves in.
Yes, hence the art. And you could also say the craft. There's both of those things important. Yeah. And the many different skills, strategies, approaches, and the importance of doing this with others. Not, that sense of like, oh, I've got to, just fight these battles on my own somehow. How do we really bring in, Sangha, community, the collective response?
Mm-hmm. So I wonder whether we should move on to the next bit of reading. And I just wanted to say to anyone who's arrived since we've started, there will be some times for questions later on. So if you have any questions or prompts, just put them in the chat, whether you're on Zoom or on YouTube, and I'll be able to bring the questions into the conversation. But River.
So this is another piece from the introduction, and it really is where I'm kind of starting to speak to the importance of reframing language and reframing perception. And I came across this lovely word, which is forgotten, has been forgotten since the 16th century. And it was actually first coined by a Scottish writer. And the word is respair, R-E-S-P-A-I-R, last recorded in 1525, and it means fresh hope, a recovery from despair. And the writer the contemporary writer that drew my attention to this, Susie Dent, argues that the English language tends to retain the negative versions of words, but not their positive counterparts. So really interesting that, of course, we still have despair, but not respair. And every time I put respair into my keyboard, it auto corrects it immediately into despair. So yeah, noticing that at the moment very much. So I'll read from these paragraphs that speak to the importance of reframing language and perception. This book aspires to offer both respair and a radical reframing. Through a collage of reflections, conversations, and creative explorations, the intention is to show that the stories we tell and how we tell them can help navigate vulnerability and existential threats. It attempts to gather resources that move against the stream of 21st century memes, the myth of eternal economic growth, the imperative of individualism and self-improvement, the pull to deny embodiment, by drawing attention to inalienable and renewable capacities. It flies in the face of late capitalism's hyper-consumerism and broken record tale of scarcity and urgency. Buy now while stocks last. Can we shift possibilities by telling a different story that subverts habits of extraction and depletion? In Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants, Robin Wall Kimmerer highlights a reciprocity that goes beyond sustainability. Professor of environmental biology and member of the citizen Potawatomi Nation, she describes her work as an intertwining of science, spirit, and story. Let's imagine, she writes, that we have the inherent ability and sense of responsibility to sustain the earth, just as we are sustained by her. The framework of immeasurable capacities, or Brahma Viharas, that is a central part of Buddhist philosophy responds directly to these questions. Kindness or friendliness, metta is the Pali word, compassion, karuna or anukampa, joy, mudita, and equanimity, upekkha, are akin to qualities valued by both secular and faith-based approaches. They are multi-dimensional, as contemplation subjects, as relational practices, as therapeutic tools, and pathways of absorption and insight. A poem by Longchenpa, a 14th century Tibetan writer and teacher, describes how they intersect. And I'm going to screen share the poem so that you can see it. So this is the poem by Longchenpa, and it was, I learnt it first from my teacher, John Peacock, who's a former Tibetan monk and now an academic and Dharma teacher. And Longchenpa, this 14th century Tibetan yogi and scholar, wrote many, many texts. And this is one of the jewels from those texts. And it shows how these Brahma Viharas, Brahma, heavenly or divine, and Vihara, a dwelling place, a place to rest, really intersect with each other. Out of the soil of friendliness grows the beautiful bloom of compassion, watered by the tears of joy, sheltered beneath the cool shade of the tree of equanimity. So this interweaving of these different capacities shows how compassion needs all of these to be sustained. And this is a diagram that Emma drew, just showing some of the ways that these interweave with each other, how compassion, equanimity, joy, metta all connect and support each other. I'm going to just read a little bit more from that section. These images reflect the premise that without the support of its companions, compassion, the capacity to care and respond, will not survive and thrive. Like other expressions of life, it requires certain conditions to flower. Without the nourishment and protection of friendliness, joy, and equanimity, it distorts into its near and far enemies: pity, overwhelm, disconnection, cruelty, and burnout.
There's a lot in there, isn't there?
There's a lot in there, yes. I realise that we're jumping in. And I guess with selecting these different extracts, I wanted to just give, you know, a flavor of some of the kind of themes. But I felt it was also really important to bring in this poem because there is a lot. There's a lot of my poetry in the book, but this poem of Longchenpa is really the kind of ground and the earth, the soil, from which a lot of the ideas in the book have sprung.
Mm.
And coming across it was the first time that I'd really understood how these capacities, these cultivations intersect with each other.
Mm. Mm. And that's in a way that the heart of the sustaining, you know, most of us might be able to have some moments of compassion or compassionate response, but they're hard to sustain, or they're hard to put down and pick up again without all of those other characteristics. And that's a bit of a thread. So actually, the way you, in this section that you've just read, you're describing the Brahma Viharas in quite traditional imagery, and in some ways drawing out the relationships between them. But actually in the book, you use different words.
It's true. I do. Yes. Why? I'm quite keen on demystifying. So, you know, I wanted this book to be really accessible to people who, you know, might not be so akin or so familiar with the Pali or the Sanskrit words in the Buddhist teachings, and who might even be kind of put off by them. And, you know, I wanted also to broaden some of those, you know, some of the ways that they're translated. Because, of course, you know, we translate metta as loving kindness, but actually that, of course, is a translation. And there's many, many different ways of translating metta and of understanding it and seeing its kind of linguistic connections, which, of course, I'm also really interested in as a poet. So I gave each chapter a heading. The first chapter is not one of the Brahma Viharas, but it's called Pausing. And I felt that this is kind of the precursor to anything, really, if we're going to sustain ourselves, the capacity to pause. And I really fleshed this out by bringing in, you know, radical rest and embodiment and many other things. But, you know, pausing, which is, of course, what we engage with when we are undertaking any kind of contemplative practice like meditation, mindfulness, prayer, and the whole realm of contemplation, is such an important precursor. And in these times of urgency and emergency, of great and grave emergency, you know, many of us might be called to act or feel like we should act, we want to act. And it can be quite kind of counterintuitive to actually pause and stop and reconnect, you know, with mind, body, heart, just as it is, with the ground or whatever it is that is resourcing us. As a real support for anything that we then might engage with. And that caring engagement might be on many different levels. It might be in our immediate, you know, work or family environments, our neighborhoods, or, you know, the whole spectrum, really. But this sort of meeting of the kind of inner and outer, you know, we could call it the inner caring and the outer caring, the inner activism and the outer activism, is so crucial, and it is something that contemplative practices can really offer, and which I see very much, particularly in, you know, the last years, seeing this being more and more valued by those who are engaged in social justice movements, that you know, regenerating and resourcing that can come from, you know, whether that's public contemplation in the form of vigils, or just, you know, people meeting, you know, to practice meditation together, or to combine meditation with action. Seeing that coming more and more to the fore is really inspiring. So this is a very long answer to your question, but there's pausing. And then the next chapter is called Befriending, which speaks to metta, but really looks at metta through lots of different lenses. And then there's enjoying. So traditionally, joy is put after compassion in the order of the Brahma Viharas, but I wanted to kind of reverse that and put it first, because joy we can often be very depleted. Can often be living in very joy depleted environments and lives, and it felt really important to kind of foreground that. And then there's the compassion, which I've called caring, really to broaden it out very widely. And then letting be, which relates to the equanimity, steadiness, balance sort of aspect of the Brahma-viharas. And the present participle, the ing, so pausing, befriending, etc., is something that I'm really interested in, how we use language to really support and aid our own practices of, say, meditation or mindfulness. That when we put things in the present participle, it becomes something that is more continuous and less kind of constricted by time or temporary structures. Whereas if we say, pause, befriend, it's much more like an imperative, and it then becomes part of the pressure, part of the kind of urgency, if you like. So that's a bit of a deep dive into the grammar side, which may not be for everybody.
Well, I'm slightly going off piste here as well, but you talked about these two things together, the interweaving of the Brahma Viharas and the necessity to have access to all of them, in a way, to actively cultivate all of them and to be able to access them, including joy. And then you also spoke in the excerpt about reframing. And you were saying there's something about how we story ourselves and the relationship between storying and existential threat, or our experience of existential threat. And just listening to, I kind of wanted to say, well, give us an example of that. But in a way, I think you're referencing language like this. In your case, it's language, isn't it? You're a poet, and there's some beautiful imagery and poetry in the book. And including literally some of your poems, but also you've brought that kind of sensibility into the writing of the book, and we've got Emma's illustrations. But it did strike me that the whole question of arts more broadly, and the ways in which creativity, let's say more broadly, is exactly part of the possibility of storying anew or reframing. I don't know if that's a good conclusion to come to from what you were saying.
Yes, definitely. Because I think through creativity, we can shift perspective and we can shift stories. And by kind of externalizing things into something that we kind of express creatively, it shifts our relationship and we see them in a different angle. We see them in a different light, or there's something emerges that you're like, wow, where did that come from? Or who's that? And that is a kind of reframing, a restorying, which I think connects to what you were saying. And of course, the trajectory of the book leads towards an exploration of, self and not self, and then how we, the stories that we construct and often constrict around, the story of me, myself, and who I am and what I should do and who I should be, and etc. We'll maybe come on to that later.
So I suggest we do, or you do, another reading now. But also, just a reminder, whether you're on YouTube or here in the Zoom room, as if this was here in the Zoom room, if you've got any questions or prompts, do write them in the chat, because I think after this next section, we'll open it up for a bit of question time. But I wonder if you want to go to the next one.
Yeah, sure. And yeah, really warm invitation to ask anything. And if there's anything that we're saying that's, not clear, or that you want to hear again or want to explain, please do let us know. So one of the themes, particularly of the pausing chapter, is of embodiment. And I think I've already mentioned that one of the, as I see it, the memes of, 21st century, the conditions we find ourselves in is a pull to deny embodiment, a pull to get, disembodied. And but often for many good reasons. And sometimes that can, be a very important survival strategy for us. But I wanted to read a little bit from the chapter on pausing that refers a bit to the body and to bypassing. And the section's actually called Body and Bypassing. We have multi-layered relationships with our bodies and are more or less aware of them at different times. The Irish writer James Joyce describes a character called Mr. Duffy, who, this is a quote, lived at a little distance from his body, regarding his own acts with doubtful side glances. Survival mechanisms and coping strategies can keep us to some degree at a distance from our bodies. Cultural and embodied identities also pile on the pressure towards disembodiment. Can we respect these histories and mechanisms and learn how to invite awareness to gather, regather, even for a moment with the felt bodily sense here and now, resting on the support of the ground beneath us? Becoming more embodied mitigates the pull to bypass lived experience through numbing, overwork, saviorism, and the spiritual bypassing that is a potential side effect of contemplative practice. Body's processes move more slowly than thoughts. They remind us to pause and send strong signals when they are overwhelmed or ignored, and sometimes insist that we listen. In recent decades, our bodies have had to become static for long periods in front of screens, and our nervous systems have become umbilically connected to smartphones. These changes have a powerful impact on embodiment. The motivation to care and act is embedded in lived experience. We may have learned to be vigilant to survive. There may have been an urgent need to get to safety as quickly and reliably as we could. In our adult lives, there will be emergencies that need response. The pathways these crises imprint on the body can become reflexes and habit patterns that no longer serve us, manifesting as hypervigilance and a tendency to catastrophize. Rest and kindness offer soothing to a nervous system that tends to fire quickly at any possible sources of alarm. To return to the body is to open a pathway for rest to take root, for resilience to grow, and wise response to flourish. The body is a sacred book, says Dharma teacher Leela Sati. It is a teaching. And this is one of my poems. Restless night and pelting dreams, yet morning brings a question. What if I was diligent caretaker of this jangling body I call my own? I move about and practice patience as if I believed in it, as if doubt was not always the sole trader here.
Mm. And partly I just love some of the wording in there. There's sort of like umbilical connection to our screen. So I was like, oh, yes, to our devices. But I think the one of the things that really struck me in that passage was the relationship between pace and pausing. There's a sort of deep logic to pausing that's not about turning away. Sort of a deep logic of pausing that allows one to stay connected and turn towards without, breaking a lot of eggs, let's say, in the response to things. And I was really struck by this idea that the body processes things more slowly than thought. And maybe we could also say that emotions process more slowly than thought. And the more disembodied we are, the more likely we are to be driven by thought, I would think. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I think more and more I'm seeing how in so many different realms this the importance of embodiment and really like turning to the body, and also, like you say, to the deep feelings that might be there stored or as responses to what we're encountering in these times. In another section of the book, I talk about particularly grief, actually, but also rage. And it's something that I've become more and more interested in, actually, since I finished writing the book, is the importance of tending to grief and doing this in community in ways that are very held and where there's a lot of safety created around that. But really letting the body take its time. And it does take time, like you say, for the grief, to flow. And, within safe banks and, finding safe channels for it, the grief, sometimes it's the rage, sometimes it's the expression of numbness or disconnection in different ways. But, I'm seeing how that is also, more and more a helpful resource in these times.
Mm. I'm aware as we're talking about the book, sort of like drawing out these bits where you've sort of stitched together a series of ideas in a way that creates a particularly strong fabric, let's say. And part of that is that you've been in conversation across the book. Each one of these chapters is in conversations with someone else or more than one person who has some wisdom and experience in this area. And particularly in this chapter, maybe you can talk a little bit about your conversations and what came up in this chapter, because it feels quite, it's one thing to talk about pausing in a context where we're just quietly having this conversation, and that's another thing to talk about pausing when the situation is a very heated situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So each chapter there is threaded through, like you say, a conversation with a practitioner, a teacher, a friend. And for this chapter, I spoke to my friends and colleagues, Zohar Navi and Nathan Glide. And they offer and have offered for many, many years retreats that combine service and engaged practice, really like hands-on work, often with meditation, and experiencing these retreats with them and seeing them pausing and really taking time away from the vital work that was going on was a real revelation to me, and like a real inspiration. I can remember the first time, and I speak about this in the book. I was on a retreat with Zohar, and we were combining, meditation with doing some environmental work. And we were working together next to each other on this bed, weeding and planting bulbs. And she was just doing it very, slowly and carefully. And I've had this sense of urgency, I brought all my habit patterns of like, let's get this done and let's get it done in the best way possible as fast as we can. Then we had piles of bulbs that we were supposed to be planting, and there was lots to do. But I was so impressed with her pace. Like you say, it's not just about the pausing, it is about the pace. And, as I say that, there is just an inherent kind of wisdom and compassion in that pace of taking things slowly, of taking care. And, seeing it kind of really like bump up against my habit patterns of, whatever, perfectionism, urgency, got to get this done as quickly as possible and get on to the next thing, was such a teaching moment, and a completely silent teaching moment. Just, Zohar's careful, with the trowel or the fork or whatever it was she was doing. yeah, just speaking about it continues to inspire me, really, that how, just very quietly, without saying anything, we can have such a powerful effect on others.
Mm. 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 We don't have any questions or prompts at the moment. So, but actually the next bit of reading that you were going to do goes really well. This goes on to, from the pausing into the kind of a befriending section that you were talking about. So the sort of mudita joy element of it. Yeah.
Yes. So I'm going to read actually from the befriending chapter, and going to, if it works, share an image. So that this image that goes with the story. So this is one of Emma's illustrations, and the story is called Flowers of Hope, Fuel of Despair. Lying on my back in the city centre, I sense the quiet, breathing bodies around me, a samba band and their silent instruments, a hush where moments ago there were speeches and chants. It's 1 year since Sheffield City Council declared a climate emergency. We are responding to the lack of subsequent action with a die-in. Later, we will enter the town hall to question city councillors. I look up, blue sky, a smattering of cloud. The pavement is cold and hard. I wonder what's been trodden into it. Glad of my coat, I think of those living outdoors on winter streets. A child's voice. I don't want to lie down. I want to run away. An adult gently responds. Would you like to put flowers on the people? A small hand places a paper rose on my chest. I remember that I've laid down on this patch of pavement before, at silent vigils opposing the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. March 2003. Brimful with rage and grief, I've marched, written letters, sung, organised meetings, joined a peace symbol made of naked bodies, stood in candlelit parks. Teetering on the edge of burnout, I join a bicycle blockade. In the morning rush hour, we bring the city to a standstill. We have no plan, no words of explanation. I have to get my kids to school, the driver yells. And the bombs are falling on Baghdad, I yell back. I feel justified and self-righteous. My response seems entirely appropriate. To spread the suffering might somehow diminish it. In due course, I recognize the despair that fueled this response, and am anguished by my lack of care for those caught in the gridlock. My motivation was revenge. I wanted to make someone suffer in a vain attempt to blot out my pain. Under this despair, concern for victims of war was mixed with the overwhelm of injustice, the terror of powerlessness. If you'd questioned whether my intentions were truly non-violent, I would have been insulted. But with hindsight, the degree of violence directed towards others and myself has become clearer. Motivation is often complex. It connects to multiple strands of collective and personal histories, and the unraveling takes time. An intention of non-harm shines a light into motivation's corners, revealing hidden agendas, self-interest, strategies aimed at getting approval. It uncovers where the savior, rescuer, and hero fantasies play out, the ways in which we might deny vulnerabilities by throwing ourselves into helping others. Take a conscious breath. How is this landing? Can the untangling be done with self-compassion, with an intention of non-harm for oneself? Can the seeds of violence in our hearts and minds be investigated and understood without subjecting them to the violence of repression, following the compass direction that invites, indeed demands, congruence? There is no way to peace. Peace is the way.
I remember reading that the first time when your manuscript landed in my inbox, or a version of it. And I suppose just being impressed at the deep honesty of opening up, the mixed motives and the energies, isn't it? The kind of differently directed energies that come up when we're both attached to something and care about something. It's a sort of like fire. To use an image, there's a sort of fire that blossoms, and it can be quite hard to figure out how much fuel to feed it and under what you put the fire, So I just wanted to say, in a way, like, I appreciate the work of pulling apart what goes into that kind of situation where we're called to do something about something, but actually the easiest thing to do is to spread the suffering, isn't it? To make things worse. And it's one of the most intoxicating forms, I think, of collective action. I suppose I wonder about the sort of subtlety of that kind of work, and the self-knowledge that's needed over time, and the fact that we're going to fail, aren't we? You don't get that right first time for sure. And the kinds of polarization that we're seeing, I don't just mean like we have active wars that we're very exposed to at the moment in terms of media, but more broadly, we're in a massively polarizing kind of public discourse and social media, or utterly distracted as well. There's always a sort of question of scale and what the subtlety of that work does or can do in a situation that's quite hot and heated.
Yes, and how just one person who is not on, inspired can have such a profound effect in that, in the kind of situations that you're describing. So, therefore we can't underestimate the impact when we ourselves are able as best we can. And like you say, there's also, the times we fail and we don't get it right, and the imperfection and everything, but the possibility of gathering and bringing some of those human capacities, which are capacities in every human heart, of the pausing and the steadiness and the befriending, we can't underestimate. And there's countless times when I've been impacted by the people I've stood alongside or just seen, or our paths have crossed momentarily. I'm sure we all have examples of that, of where we've been caught in something, and then there's something that just helps us gather in again and not kind of perpetrate the cycles of suffering that we might have been caught in. And yes, it is long term. I mean, this is it's a lifetime exploration and journey, and that's also where we can see it as a creative process. We don't say, right, I've done that, and now whatever, not gonna be, I'm not going to sing anymore or write any more poems, or, that's that, it's over. It's like, when we're in that kind of, when we have that kind of interest in something creative, there's something that draws us to keep ploughing that furrow. And yes, it is long term. And for me, there have been many moments of recognizing that, that's those seeds of violence in myself, which, like you say, very, and like I've written about, very hard to recognize when there's a very strong self-construct of, that teenage peace activist who's going on the, CND marches and going to Greenham Common and everything. That becomes such a kind of powerful self-construct that to admit the opposite of that does take some time, and it does take some, really some, contemplation and, being fortunate enough to have time, for example, on retreat, where some of that can surface, and where I've been fortunate enough to have the support of wise and compassionate teachers who can, hold some of that. And we can do that for each other in Sangha as well.
Mm. It certainly makes me think that it would be a good place to go to now to look at view and sort of self-view.
Shall I read the Shoreline piece from the Letting Be chapter? Because then that we can weave in the self-construct piece to that. And again, I'm going to share an image so it gives you a sense of the illustration that accompanies this. So this is a story about a seal pup. And the story is called Shoreline. At low tide, we find a seal pup lying on the rocks. 1.5 meters long, it raises its head, yaps, and stares at us. Google says it's usual for pups to be left on their own. Don't get too close. It's almost 2 months before grey seals come ashore to give birth on the North Sea coast. Will the mother return? Fish stocks are depleted. Perhaps she's searching for food. The white fur that encased the pup as a newborn is molting, but it's still unable to fish for itself. A local resident collecting litter says seals do come out of the water around here, and as long as dogs and people stay at a distance, it should be fine. Google turns up a report of a seal pup attacked here last year. I wonder about people I've seen who might hurt animals. My prejudices pick out likely ones. It's easy to break one's heart over a stranded seal pup, out of its natural element, unable to move. The compassion thought police waver between, you always want to ignore things when something must be done, and you take too much responsibility for things beyond your control. Next day, the worried one is still in the driving seat. More Googling reveals that there are 2 kinds of seal in this area, grey and common. Common seals are the least common. They have different shaped heads, are smaller, their breeding season begins earlier, and pups can swim soon after birth. We've seen a common seal, probably an adolescent. Anxiety settles. I've constructed a doom-laden picture. My mind bounces into a more hopeful relationship with experience. The optimistic version of myself takes shape. Perhaps I can forget about seals for now. Reading more widely, I learn that common seals have declined by 50% since 2000 due to unknown causes. despair worms its way back in. The depressed self comes into being. I also find researchers' blogs patiently documenting seal populations, and watch a video of a seal giving birth, her rolling contractions, the slippery, pulsating newborn as it emerges, mother and pup nuzzling each other, the tide coming in, mother encouraging pup to begin swimming. There is a narrow viewpoint, contracted around and co-arising with a fixed sense of self, always lacking the full information. And there is a bigger picture. It's true that something must and can be done, but the voices of denial and despair have contracted and diminished my ability to do it. I resolve to walk the shoreline again and pay more attention, to look out for the fishing debris that can harm seals, to support charities that protect marine wildlife.
Mm-hmm. What are you wanting that story to do to us as readers or listeners?
Well, I think, as I've sort of touched on a bit, to show the workings of them, how our minds work. This is not going to be unfamiliar to us, but how we get, fixed into one particular groove, into one particular story, bringing in the stories again. And, then we can flip flop to another one. And of course, this sort of flip flopping between, alarm and denial is something that I can very much relate to. And it's, at the moment, it feels like a kind of daily investigation. Where is the denial? Where is the alarm? What else is here? Kind of asking again and again, what else is here? What else is here? How can I, broaden out the perspective to take in? So it's not just the binary, I think, because the mind tends to fall, like you were saying, that polarization. We tend to fall into that either or. And, for me, this is really at the heart of why I practice, is to invite greater possibility and to keep seeing how that possibility can manifest, and to keep noticing, okay, when have I fallen into the binary and the polarities, and how can I expand from that? So in a way, I think this goes to the heart of, the Buddha's teaching on training the mind and heart. And the word training, I always have, slight qualms about using it, because I have a bit of a weightlifter image with training. It's probably because I don't go to the gym and I have, a whole set of assumptions about it. But, I want to find another word, and maybe the word is cultivating, or maybe it's practicing or whatever. But this, one of these extraordinary parts of Dharma teachings, that there is a mind and heart that can be trained. And like in the beginning of the Dhammapada, the untrained mind, what follows it? What follows it is sorrow. And, it's not that we can be exempt from sorrow. There is so much sorrow in our lives and in our worlds. And we can cultivate a mind that can meet it and find a different relationship with it.
Yeah, there's the sort of image of that comes to mind is that outside of these flip-flops, and I was really interested when you were, I hadn't noticed it when I had read this, but I noticed it when you spoke it, that you talked about like the depressed self and the optimistic self. It's not just that those were moods or emotions that went by, like that you attached the idea of a self to those flip-flops, if you like. And then there's something else which is sort of fruitful or generative. That perhaps you don't give the word self to. I don't know. Maybe I'm drawing it out too far. But
yes, I mean, what I noticed reading it is that I kind of miss out there's a sentence where I talk about, the depressed and the despairing self, but I actually don't put in the optimistic self also as a kind of, as a construct. So that shows my bias. I mean, one of the things that I did, this is a bit of a kind of tangent from your question really, but in researching and writing this book, it did generate a lot more optimism for me actually, because it meant that I really did a deep dive into a lot of different places, people, organizations where, compassion is really foregrounded in these times, and where, the response to, climate and ecological emergencies and all the interrelated crises of war and etc. That there is such a kind of, what I tapped into was, more than I had ever realized was there in terms of the kind of groundswell of, compassionate and creative response. So the book actually really helped me find a lighter place to be with it. But one can get fixated on that, and it is another place where we can bypass and not want to look at reality and go into denial. And again, that's where the creativity comes in, and the kind of honesty and the questioning and so on.
What did you notice about the people who most inspired or changed your perception of what is possible?
I notice the word that comes to mind is, love against the odds. That there are, and there are countless people out there. I think of the people in my village who run the tree planting group. I think of people that I connected with on the other side of the world doing a kind of, compassion project challenge thing. So much love. It sounds corny and it sounds, cliched. But there is still a great deal of that in amongst everything that is terrible and, escalating. And, the quote that I use at the beginning of the book from a book that I read while I was writing this, from wonderful philosopher, writer, activist Alistair McIntosh. And he writes, "A crisis is too good a chance to waste. There is a gift as well as dread in living through these times." And, I came to really sense into that in a much more embodied way. The gift of this is that we can, as best we can, and some, in some moments, and for some of this, it's the micro steps of, meeting ourselves with a moment of kindness, meeting the person we pass in the street with a moment of kindness. But there is that potential that is being called out of us in this time, and being called on.
Even that little tiny snippet of the story that you spoke of earlier with the child who was called to lie down, who wanted to run away. Third option is not either to lie down or to run away, but it's to put a flower on the people. I just thought that was a really lovely example, I think, of what I'm feeling into from what you were saying in that passage, really. It's like it doesn't have to be do what I say or run away.
Yeah. And there's a story that I also talk about being in the midst of an XR, mass protest, a lot of tension, a lot of arrests happening. And I don't know whether I don't know whether to leave it to people to find in the book, but these people dressed as kangaroos come bouncing through, and it just breaks the tension. And on those kind of mass demonstrations, there are just countless moments of that kind of creativity and humor and lightness, and it's extraordinary to witness it and to behold it. And yeah, the more cynical part of me can really go into the groove of like, yes, but it's not enough, and our governments need to do this, and there's still these incredible vested interests of who our addiction to fossil fuels and the connection with the military industrial complex. And I can really go down that route, and to hold that in balance with what else is there, the love, the creativity, the joy, the community. To hold all of that, it feels like I've not been, many of us have not been trained to hold all of that together. How do I do that? How do I really, hold these? It's such a kind of juggling act sometimes. And, as I sense into it, it's really that, how do I keep my heart open? Sometimes it has to close, and sometimes I just have to, distract myself. And, often that is an appropriate response. But yeah, letting the heart be supple, which is another theme in the book, of like and a phrase that I borrowed from the writer Partha Palmer, the supple heart, that can learn to expand and soften, so that when the deep, difficult, hard to bear things come in our lives and in our communities and our world, as they do come, as they will come, the heart doesn't fracture and splinter into a million pieces, but it can find a way of accommodating and flexing and being supple enough to find the capacity to bear.
I think the thing that also points to is connection. Like, it's only a subtle and an open heart that can remain connected, and a connected heart is much less likely to, shatter, to objectify, to forget. To forget the sort of the means and ends question that's so deeply problematic in that sort of opening story that you told about kind of a very particular kind of lefty politics versus something that's that tries to keep connected and heart opened and attending to view, I think. Yes. Should we go on to the
move on to the final extract? And this is from the end of the book. And it speaks about something that came out of a tragic event in June 2016. I think on the eve of the Brexit vote, the British MP Jo Cox was killed by a white supremacist while she was working in her constituency. Jo was a principled and compassionate politician who had worked for Oxfam and Save the Children. Her maiden speech in Parliament included the words, "We are far more united and have far more in common than that which divides us." So 1 year on from her murder, there was an event called the Great Get Together, a weekend of street parties, picnics and concerts, marking the anniversary of Jo's death by celebrating her life and legacy. And I was invited to read poetry at one of these events, so I wrote this sonnet, inspired by the scientific evidence that all known living organisms evolved from a common ancestor.
Mm.
In common, first breath, last, a pulse. Put your fingers here on my throat where each beats felt. Strangers or enemies, we breathe each other's air. And then the trees will keep on breathing when we've left. 4 billion years since that first chemical reaction in the mud. And still we share some DNA with all that moves, is sensitive, takes in, gives out. So ununique, our flinch or flight from threat, the restless mix of wanting and not wanting to arrive to sit in peace. In common, stomachs churn, the pull of dread, hate's easy reflex, the urge to say, them, us. And yet, our fierce capacity to break at children's deaths, to fling ourselves at life, raise millions in an hour, to run, to give up everything we have for what we love.
Mm. Don't really know what to say after that. It's sort of that question of what do we attend to in the midst of these things that have both what we have in common and the bits that pull us apart, that set us in opposition to each other, that close down the heart. And maybe over and over and over again, you've been saying, turn to that which is alive and connected and can feel and is sensitive and is humbled by that.
And also not to gloss over the things, the many ways in which our identities and our conditioned realities are different and can be very different, the kind of social and racial and gender identities that mean that people have vastly different experiences and the great disparities of everything, you name it, access to health, resources and education, and simply span of life. So to not gloss over that in any way. But something about that. When I first heard that, that thing about we all evolve, we have this common ancestor. So, with blades of grass and mice and fruit flies, gives a very different kind of perspective to our interconnection with other forms of life.
Thank you, River, for for bringing alive these passages in the book. And there's a lot of richness and depth and data and complexity between these elements. Each one of these modes or moods is sort of unfolded in the course of the book, in images, in poetry, in concepts, in practices, and sort of guided meditations that go with it. So we've just picked out these moments to write a story between those moments. So I think we should give a last chance for any comments or questions.
Yes, very welcome. Anything, your responses, anything that resonates or doesn't resonate, anything that doesn't make sense, please do. It's quite a new process for me of reading parts from the book and seeing how they land with people. And it's sort of going off on its own little journey into the world now, which is exciting.
Mm.
Of course, there's so many people who have contributed to it. It's weird in a way to be here kind of responding to these questions because, it really is such a, I hope that it really mirrors and reflects community and the power of the collective, because it is so, there's so many wonderful contributions in here from others.
Mm. We have a message from Shrivati. Hi, Shrivati. Saying it's really lovely to hear the thoughtfulness and stories and poetry.
Thank you.
Such an encouraging message, maybe for those of us who feel overwhelmed at times.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, who wouldn't? Who wouldn't feel even overwhelmed? So important to honor that, and that all the kind of shoulds and oughts can come in so many different guises. Should be able to kind of take it all, or should do more, and there's a lot in the book that goes into how we can work creatively with that, with those habit patterns and thought patterns. I referenced it in the story about the seal, the compassion thought police, that can come in many different guises.
Mm.
I could also screen share some of the images from the book, if that would be
Nice.
oh, thank you, Chris.
So Chris says, thank you for this evening. Particularly loved the last poem. Looking forward to reading the book. With a bunch of emojis.
The Longchenpa. I'll screen share the Longchenpa poem again. And a lovely question from Amy. Wonderful to hear excerpts from the book and to see Emma's paintings. It's hard to sum this up in a quick chat question, but have you been able to give yourself the same care you offer to others? Oh, thanks, Amy. Very good question. It's definitely a kind of ongoing journey, and something which varies from day to day. I can see, over, I mean, I don't know if you mean like during the sort of writing of the book or just in general, but I mean, over the years, I can see that there's, I can feel that I'm able to, care and take in care much, much more easily. When I think back to, and it's interesting reading that, that story about being an 18-year-old going to the USSR and thinking back to that person back then, and in many ways, what a fragile kind of being that teenager was, and how since then I think I have learnt quite a few helpful ways of self-care, and just the idea that that's important, that self-compassion is important, and that kindness to myself, which is a real journey. And one of the stories I talk about in the book is, when I first heard about kindness to oneself, and I was invited to, imagine like a warm sensation in the body, or, offer friendliness, it just bounced off. I was like, I have no idea what they're talking about. It was like they were speaking a completely foreign language. And I think this is often, a common experience, actually, that many of us don't have landing places for self-care, self-kindness, and there might be all kinds of conditions and habit patterns and cultural patterns why that is. So, yeah, have I been able to give myself, definitely not always a work in progress. And yeah, trying to head in that direction as a way of the phrase I use in the book is filling as you pour, recognizing more and more that unless there is, unless this one is resourced enough and it's, being able to offer what I can to others, it's just not possible. Really, the vessel needs to have nourishment and resource to be able to and actually, writing the book was very nourishing, as I said earlier, because of the ways in which I tapped into lots of different forms of compassion happening all over the world. And because I was fortunate enough to have some time to go away a couple of occasions and write and practice. And that was just a real joy. I mean, it was really hard at times. And sometimes I was just lying down going, I can't write another word. I set myself a goal of 2,000 words a day and I was just like tapping them out. Any old rubbish will do kind of mode of getting a book written. So it was a struggle in moments, but there were also moments when it was a real delight and a real privilege to have that time to put into writing and practicing. So the long Srimati says, the sustainable resource of river, yes. Indeed, need to sustain ourselves. So I'm going to just share the Longchenpa poem again and read it again. Maybe that's a nice way to finish. And then I'll share some of the other images. Out of the soil of friendliness grows the beautiful bloom of compassion, watered by the tears of joy, sheltered beneath the cool shade of the tree of equanimity. So this is an image from pausing. This is befriending. One of the many images in the befriending chapter. Tuning into the ground of friendliness. This is from enjoying, finding the key of joy. Caring, circle of compassion. One of the images I use for this is finding a place in the band, finding one's seat in the band, knowing that it's not just me alone doing this by myself. And then letting the music play through you, play through us. With the last seal pop.
Thank you. I feel like we've had a lot of you. You've been very present, like not just in the book, but in the way you've been engaging about the book and the ideas in the book and the motivation of the book to help people who may be overwhelmed or struggling to keep that kind of balance or resource themselves, or learning those set of skills so that we can become more engaged. This is not just about people who are very engaged who need some rest. It's also about being able for more of us to become engaged because we're resourced to do it and doing it together. So I just really appreciate this. And those of you who've been here now sort of live, if you like, or secondhand live through YouTube, and all the people who will be looking at this after the fact, I hope that you take the opportunity to read River's book at some point. And Walter's just put in the chat where you can buy the book, which is great, and how you can support the work of Windhorse to make books like this in the future as well. So thank you, River.
Oh, thank you so much, Dhammamegha. You've really supported this from the beginning, and there's so much, so many places in the book where you suggested something or a phrase or, editing it in some way that was super, super helpful. And, one thing that you put in the joy chapter was the experience of joy is often simple, something about the simplicity of joy. And I often think about that and think that was such a wonderful insight and so perfect for that place in the book, reminding us that joy, can be really very simple. It doesn't have to be complicated. And, for that and many, many other things, enormous gratitude to you, and a lot of gratitude to Walter doing the tech and the social media. Thank you so much. And to the Windhorse team. Thank you.